Now let's look at some newer possibilities. We can take those traditional dissonance formulas, we can elaborate them, we can reevaluate them, and we can extend them. For example, we could apply them to chords as opposed to single notes. Let's look at example 2a. In this example, first of all, I started off with a chord that's already dissonant, a seventh chord, and then I made a double neighbor note to it, coming back to the first chord. So what we have here is the same principle as a neighbor note, but instead of starting from a consonance and finishing with a consonance, I'll start with a dissonance and finish with a dissonance. Let's listen to that again. 2A. We could also extend that somewhat. For example, we could have several dissonant chords of that type in a row in a full texture. Let's look at example 2b. Same idea, just worked out a little farther. As you can see, this is all basically working around a D minor chord, okay? But on top we have the seventh, that same neighbor note, and another neighbor note in the middle. Notice that the middle parts are also moving. Again, let's listen to the whole thing. Example 2b. Another possibility is we can have more than one dissonance in a row. Instead of just having consonance, dissonance, consonance, I can move between two consonant notes, but have several dissonances in a row. Example 3. Example 3 could have been done diatonically like this. All the notes are in the same scale, but here, by adding the A flat and the G flat, I get a sense that the melody is a little bit in conflict with the harmony. Again, example 3. So what we've just seen is a kind of passing note, or an elaboration of the passing note idea. We can do something similar with the neighbor note idea. Normal neighbor note is stepwise. Here would be an example. But what if the neighbor note, instead of going by step, goes by leap? Example 4a. We could also have two neighbor notes instead of just one, two of these big neighbor notes. Example 4b. As long as we have the feeling that there is a basic stable note at each end, and we come back to it, there's still the sense that it's a neighbor note, even if it has leaps involved. But this also gives the possibilities for many interesting harmonic colors. You can experiment with many of those colors. They could be in the same scale or not. Each one will give you different effects. We could also combine two kinds of dissonance at the same time. Let's look at example 5a. In 5a, if you look at the top of 5a, the top line, we have an accented passing note on the E flat, but in the middle line in the right hand, we have a neighbor note. Combining the two, we get that. So that gives you a rather interesting color. Here's 5a without the middle part. Here's 5a without the top part. 5a with both. Here's another example of combining different kinds of dissonances. Let's look at example 5b. If we look at this one, the melody has a suspension. The middle part has a neighbor note. Combination. Which again gives us a kind of interesting color. The dissonances are moving along in fourths for a moment. We could also look at a few other possibilities. For example, the suspension principle, the idea that the melody and the harmony are out of sync with each other, that one is delayed, can be applied on a bigger scale than just one single chord. We saw it in example 1a. But what if we do a whole bunch of chords, starting from a consonance, ending on a consonance, but in between a bunch of suspensions? Example 6a. If you look at this, you see that it starts from a C major chord, goes down. The left hand starts same chord and goes up. Combination, example 6a. It makes sense, even though some of the chords in between are quite dissonant, because it's all stepwise. If we take away the stepwise motion, it just sounds like wrong notes. So this is a good example of what I would call linear dissonance. It's dissonance using the same principle as the suspension, but stretched out on a bigger scale. We can have another example of the same thing, example 6b. If we look at this one, you will see that if I take away the suspensions, the harmonies are on the whole pretty consonant, but the delays give a much more interesting flavor to the line. Let's listen to that again, example 6b. We mentioned ornamental resolution already. Here's a more elaborate example of the same thing. Example 7. If we look at this, it starts off this way, which looks a lot like it's going to be a suspension, and eventually resolves like that. The only difference is that instead of just holding a suspension, I make a whole elaboration around it. So listen again to example 7. It's important to note in this example that because I have some rather elaborate figuration, that the figuration in both hands is based on the same motive. That's just to avoid confusion. As a general rule, if your harmony is very complex, it's best to be careful about not having too much motivic variety at the same time. Otherwise, the music can simply lose coherence. In this case, the motives help make the whole passage hang together. Then we get to what we might call irregular resolutions. Example 8a. That would have been normally, here that's a little bit like our earlier example. We did the resolution in a different voice from the original dissonance. Same principle. If we look at example 8b, we can have a dissonance that resolves into another dissonant chord, 8b. So the resolving chord is this, which is itself a dissonance, but it still works as a whole because it's conjunct. The conjunct motion holds it together. We could also do the same thing with a much more surprising chord. Here's a fairly simple example, 8C1. That's pretty straightforward, but now look at this, 8C2. I resolved into another dissonance, but it's in a different key. So we started off in what seems like D minor, but then I go, which is like a 5/7 of E. Result, 8C2. So that again gives us a rather interesting color. Okay, there's also the whole issue of pedal tones. As you probably know, a pedal tone simply means one note that stays the same while the harmonies change, below it or above it. We can also, however, have what we might call an ornamented pedal. Example 8D. As you can see here, the right hand pretty much repeats the same thing with a very mild variation at the end. The left hand moves along in its own series of harmonies. Note that the bass is stepwise. But the result is we have a kind of triple pedal. Instead of one note staying the same, we have three notes staying the same, no matter what the chords are underneath. Sometimes the notes in the melody are part of the chords underneath, like the beginning. And at other times, for example, the end of measure 2, they're completely different notes. But the pedal point, because it's stable, gives your ear a kind of point of reference. The fact that the bass is stepwise also helps because it makes the direction very easy to seize. Let's listen to that again. 8D.